Hello, I'm Liz Jones, and welcome to Beaducation.com. Today I'm going to be showing making a daisy component using your fusing skills. This component can really be a stepping stone to make any shape component that you want. This is an advanced technique, so I recommend that you have some fusing experience before you get started. In today's class, we're going to discuss fusing shapes together to make a daisy component. And this daisy component can be very versatile and used in different ways, pictured here as either a pendant for a necklace or earrings. You could also use this same component as the centerpiece for a strung bracelet. Anything that you can imagine, you can use these components for. The pliers that we're going to be using today are round nose pliers, which have conical tips for making wire wrap loops nice and round and pretty. Also, I have two pairs of chain nose pliers. These are flat on the inside and will be used to grab and manipulate the metal. And last, but certainly most important, a pair of Tron-X razor flush cutters. When you are fusing, it's really important that the cut be absolutely perfect and precise in order to have successful results. So I prefer working with these pliers. What makes these razor flush is just below the screw joint, there's a small screw that sticks out between the handles. And this prevents the jaw of the cutter from overlapping and making a really pronounced pinch. There are some limitations to these cutters. You'll want to make sure not to use these on anything heavier than 14 gauge in fine silver and 20 gauge in sterling silver. I never use these cutters on any base metal, and I don't even look at memory wire with them. Probably one of the most important tools when you're fusing is a mandrel. I have several different styles of mandrels here. These are stepped mandrels that have 5 different sizes on each of the mandrels. These are really great. It's essentially 10 tools in 2, and you can make a variety of different size of rings. I also like to repurpose things around my house to do other jobs for me, so Sharpies are possibly one of my favorite mandrel, or perhaps a pen. I also use nail polish bottles. My can opener also has awesome round handles, so I use that a lot. In your quest for the perfect mandrel though, something like this hammer has this spot right here that would probably make a great size ring. But let's just say that you wrap your wire around here. How are you going to be able to get it off? It's important that you pick a mandrel that is either straight or tapered so that you will be able to remove your wire afterwards. We're also going to be using a bench block. This is a stainless steel block that we will use to hammer our metal flat and put some texture into it. And the hammer that we're actually going to be using, this is a chasing hammer. When I'm looking for a chasing hammer to work with, I prefer to find one that has a slightly domed face. The slight dome to the face makes it so that when you are hammering, you don't hit the metal with the edge of the hammer and leave a bunch of marks in it. The other end has a ball for putting texture into the metal. When you're setting up your fusing station, there's a couple of important things to know. The first thing, and possibly the most important, is having some sort of protective surface for the table that you are working on. What I've got here is a piece of stainless steel sheet. You can pick this up at Lowe's or someplace like that. Usually your local hardware store will have it. This is going to be there to protect the tabletop that you're working on, so if your torch falls over or you drop any hot metal, this will be there to protect the surface, which is really important if you're like me and you do your fusing on your dining room table at home. This is a fire brick or kiln brick, usually used in the construction of kilns. This is a thermal brick that retains heat and allows the metal to heat up enough to actually fuse. It retains heat, which means that it stays really hot. So I can touch it right now because we haven't used our torch on the surface yet, but you will want to keep in mind, once you have pointed your torch at the surface of this brick, it will get very warm and stay warm for quite a while. If you need to move your brick around, you can usually grab the sides because they'll stay nice and cool, but any surface that you point the torch at is going to get very hot. Instead of using your fingers to move things around on your brick, I recommend using a pair of tweezers. This will help you keep from burning yourself. A quick note on what you're using to handle your hot metal. You can also use an inexpensive pair of chain nose pliers, but you want to keep in mind that whenever you're using your tool in the heat, it's actually going to anneal the metal and make it very soft. So if I were using a pair of pliers, as my hot pliers, and then I went to try to do wire work with them, the tips would bend and the pliers would be ruined. So it's important to use an old or inexpensive or crappy pair of pliers. We're also going to be using a small handheld butane torch. One thing to keep in mind about the torch when you're using it is all of the metal on the front of the torch is going to get very hot. So again, I can touch this right now because we haven't been using the torch yet. But once the torch has been lit, you'll just want to take care not to touch any of the parts on the front of the torch. I also have a small bowl filled with cold water, and this is here so that I can fuse my metal and then take it and drop it into the bowl of water, which instantly brings it to a temperature that you can touch. When you do this to metal, it is called quenching. Silver does not have to be quenched. You could let it sit there and air cool, but who wants to sit around and wait for the metal to cool? So you will want to make sure that when you are quenching your items, you go ahead and drop them fully into the water and then pull them out so that you're sure the metal is cool enough to touch. All of the wire that we're going to be using for fusing is going to be fine silver wire. Fine silver is actually 99.9% pure silver versus sterling, which is 92.5% silver, and then 7.5% another metal, usually copper. When you heat sterling silver, there are additional steps required to prepare the metal to prevent the copper from oxidizing and creating a black on the surface, which is called fire scale. When you heat fine silver, because it's pure metal, you don't have any of those problems. I'm going to be working with 14 gauge to actually create the daisy, and then 20 gauge, which is going to come in handy for creating the daisy. And I've also used the 20 gauge to create a ball head pin. If you need a refresher on creating a ball head pin, you can also check out our ball head pin video. This is approximately 2 feet of 14 gauge and about a foot of 20 gauge. I also have some beads for an embellishment. Don't feel like you have to use these beads. You can use any bead or embellishment that you like for these earrings, so if purple's not your thing, you can go ahead and pick something else. I also have a pair of sterling silver ear wires and also some sterling silver jump rings that I'm going to use to just give the earrings a little bit more swing when I attach the ear wire. For making my jump rings, I'm actually going to use a pen as my mandrel. Whenever I'm working with a pen or a Sharpie or something like that, I like to hold it in my non-dominant hand. So for all you righties, that means your left hand, and lefties, that means your right hand. And I actually like to hold the cap end inside of my hand so it's out of the way and not causing any problems. So I'm going to pick up my wire and I'm going to place it on the front side of the pen, leaving a nice 2 to 3 inch tail hanging down below the pen. Then I can reach around and grab the other end of the wire, and I'm going to pull it tightly down and around my pen, starting to make a coil. Ideally, you want all of your coils to be touching, like this one is not. So it is a nice, even, pretty coil. And you can just keep wrapping until you reach the end of the wire. Okay, so if you take a second to look at this nice 3-inch tail that I left myself, it shrunk a little bit while I was holding on to it. The reason that I like to have people leave this tail is it hurts like crazy when you're trying to hold on to a really short, sharp piece of wire and coil it around. So the last thing I'm going to do is go ahead and take this tail and push it down as much as I can without injuring myself, so I have less wasted wire. Once you've made your coil, you can go ahead and take it off of your mandrel. You will want to be careful not to drop this on the floor. Fine silver is very, very soft, so if you should happen to drop it, you can misshape your coil. All of the cutting that we're going to be doing is going to be on one end of the coil, so I don't want you to cut here and then flip the coil over and you're going to cut on the other side. We're going to do all of our cutting on one end. If we actually take a look at the end of this coil, this piece that I couldn't quite push down without hurting myself is still a completely straight piece of wire, and then the wire starts to curve into a circle. The first thing that we need to do is get rid of that straight piece of wire so that what we're left with is a fully curved circle. It will be much, much easier to fuse if you set yourself up to do well. When I'm cutting, I like to hold both the coil and the cutters kind of up in front of my face so that I can see what's going on. Going to where the curve of the circle is, I'm actually going to face the flat side of my cutters away from the tail of the wire I'm getting ready to cut. And I'm just going to line it up on here. Now before I cut, what I am looking for is a really sharp 90-degree angle between the wire and the flat side of the cutters, right here where they meet. When you see that, you know that you are going to be leaving yourself a perfectly flat perpendicular flush cut, which is what we need. Another note about cutting 14 gauge wire, because it's a heavy gauge of wire, pieces tend to go flying across the room, so you'll want to make sure to hold on to the tail or put your hand over it or do whatever you have to do not to blind yourself or anyone else in the room. So I'm just going to cut, and the tail should fall off, and what I'm left with is a nice perfectly flat perpendicular flush cut. Because the razor flush cutters cut flush on one side and angled on the other, if I were to just go ahead and cut the next ring just like this, my flush cut would not be in the right place. So in order to cut the other side of this ring flush, I'm actually just going to flip my cutters over and line it up right where I cut the first one without actually recutting it. Keep in mind when you're doing this that the only surface of these cutters that's actually going to cut is the very, very top surface. So you can get pretty close. So I'm going to line it up here, and now because I flipped my cutters over, I'm looking on the other side for my 90-degree angle. So I was looking underneath before, and now I'm looking on top, just where the wire meets the cutter. So you can squeeze, oops, and cut, and one ring should fall off. What you should be left with are two perfectly flush, beautiful flush cuts. The cut that's left on the coil is an ugly cut, but that's okay. It's totally supposed to be like that, so we're going to learn to work around that. So in order to keep cutting on this coil, I'm going to flip my cutters back into the original cutting position with the flat side of the cutter facing away from the tail. And I'm just going to cut off that last little ugly bit so that what I'm left with is a perfectly flush cut. This is when the pieces of wire really tend to start flying, so you'll want to be careful. Now that I've done that, I can flip my cutters over, line it up, and cut the next coil. So the moral of this cutting story is every single ring that you are going to cut requires two cuts to make. First you have to trim the ring flush, and then flip the cutters over and cut it loose. For closing jump rings, I like to use 2 pairs of chain nose pliers. And the reason for having 2 pairs of pliers is you will save a lot of wear and tear on your fingers. So I'm just going to grab the ring in a pair of chain nose pliers, grab the other side with my second pair, and I'm actually going to press the 2 sides of the ring towards each other until they overlap slightly. By forcing this overlap, what I'm actually doing is putting pressure from the 2 sides of the joint on the joint to help keep it very closed, which makes our fusing job a lot easier. Once you have overlapped, you can just grab with your pliers and you can kind of hear it scraping against itself while it's closing. You want to make sure your ring is perfectly closed and lined up as well as it possibly can be. Not only when you're looking at it from this direction, but also from this direction. You can see I've got a little bit of a raised side on the left here. So I'm just going to come in with my pliers and gently give it a little nudge till it's lined up perfectly. The more perfectly you line up your ring, the better chance you will have of it fusing successfully. Now I have 6 perfectly closed jump rings that are ready to fuse. Each of the daisy links that we are going to create requires 6 rings to make. I have my rings laid out on my brick. You can actually fuse more than 1 ring lighting your torch. You'll just want to make sure that you have space in between them so they don't get fused together accidentally. I'm going to close all of these rings independently of each other because when we are talking about joining shapes together or anything like that, it's best if you don't have to worry about the seam of your ring while you're trying to join shapes together. torch that I'm going to be using, this is a micro torch. This is what's sold at Beaducation.com. To light this torch, on the back there is a large round silver button, and just below that there is a little black square of plastic that is actually the safety. I don't know if you can see that. This is the safety right here. So to light this torch, you'll want to pull down on the safety until it clicks. Once it clicks, the safety is off and the torch can be lit. I recommend using the front part of your thumb and not actually your thumbnail to pull that down because it hurts a little bit. If you try to light this torch and for whatever reason it shouldn't light, you will have to pull that safety back down every single time. Once I've pulled the safety down, I'm just going to press and hold the trigger. Press and hold this button on the side that says continuous. Release the trigger first, and then the torch should stay lit. We're now going to dim the studio lights so that you will fully be able to see the ring fuse. Now my torch is lit, so I'm going to begin fusing my rings. When I'm fusing a lot of jump rings at once, I always like to start with my leftmost jump ring and then work to the right. This way the heat from the brick is not radiating up onto my hand, which gets a little bit uncomfortable. If you are left-handed, you of course would want to start with your rightmost ring and then work to the left. When you look at the flame of the torch, you should be able to see this bright blue cone sticking out of the front of the torch. If it were a little bit darker in here, what we would see is a dark blue cone that goes around the bright blue cone, but this bright blue cone is actually the coldest part of the flame. Luckily for us, it's also telling us where to work because the hot spot, the sweet spot of this torch, is just beyond that bright blue cone, and that's where you want to try to work when you're fusing to get maximum heat. So I'm just going to pick up my torch and making sure not to hold it straight up and down like this. I'm sure you can see my flame is fluttering and sputtering, which means I'm not getting as hot and consistent of a flame as I should from this torch. I'm going to hold it at an angle with the base closer to the table. Working just beyond that bright blue cone, I'm very evenly going to heat up this ring. And what you're going to see is it's going to start to look brushed or matte finish and glow slightly orange. When you see slick and shiny, you will actually want to reduce the heat of your torch by lifting up slightly, maybe 1/4 to 1/2 inch from the ring, and then wiggle on the joint to close it up. I'll show you again on this next ring. I'm just going to very evenly heat up this ring. And the key to having a very successful fusing experience is even heat. The more even your heat is, the better the results will turn out. So it's starting to look brushed or matte finish and glowing orange. I'm looking for slick and shiny, and then I'm going to pull back and wiggle on that joint till it closes. Once you see the joint close, you will want to get your heat away from that ring as fast as you can. Now I have fused all of my rings, so I'm going to pick them up with my tweezers and not my fingers because these little rings are very, very hot, and then drop them into my quenching bowl so that they can cool off and we can continue working with them. Now that the rings are fused, we have to shape them to actually make a daisy. So I'm going to use 2 pairs of chain nose pliers. And I'm going to pick my ring up and I'm going to grab through the center of the ring with the tip of my chain nose plier. And then I'm going to grab just next to that with my second pair of chain nose pliers. So they are right next to each other. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring both pair of pliers to create a V shape on the end of the ring. Once you have bent this, it should look kind of like an elongated teardrop. This is going to end up looking like a piece of pie. So to turn our teardrop into pie, I'm going to grab my chain nose pliers and I'm going to squeeze right in the very corner on one side and then on the other, which kind of sharpens up the point just a little bit. And then I can gently squeeze down the side. You'll want to be careful not to go too far out on your side of your piece of pie. Otherwise, it'll take more than 6 of them to make a circle, which is not what we're going for. So ideally, what we want to end up with is a wide piece of pie. A little bit of troubleshooting on shaping. I like to shape one ring and then use it as a template for the rest of my rings. So I will take the rest of them after I shape them and lay them on top to make sure I've got really even, consistent shaping. The more even and consistent your shape is, the easier it's going to be to join these together. If your piece of pie ends up getting too skinny, It's really, really easy to widen. You'll just want to take your chain nose pliers and slip them right in the top and pull apart with your pliers. That would be to widen it. If it should get too short, which sometimes happens, you would do the exact same thing, only grabbing from top to bottom in your pie and pulling out with your pliers. Now I've shaped all of the petals of my daisy, and as you can see, they're all lining up pretty perfectly in a circle. When I look at this, what I am looking for is the sides of each petal of the daisy should be nice and snug against each other so there's not a lot of space in between them. By squeezing down the sides of the rings with the pliers when we were shaping our little pieces of pie, we've actually flattened the wire, which means now instead of two curved surfaces of wire where there's only one small point of contact right in the center, we have two flat surfaces up against each other, which gives us a lot larger chance for success for fusing. If you have trouble getting all of your rings to line up perfectly into a circle, you could fuse half of the daisy and then the other half of the daisy, and after they were put together, join them into a full daisy. Now we're all set up to go ahead and fuse our daisy, and we've set ourselves up to be successful by making sure that each of the petals is fully touching the one next door. I'm also going to show you a quick way to cheat a little bit and pretend like we have solder even though we're not using solder. I've cut some pieces of 20 gauge wire that are a little bit shorter than the length of the seam that I'm going to be fusing. I'm actually going to take this and put it right in the seam. Whoa, shaky hands. So now, because this small piece of wire is here and because it's a fine gauge, it's actually going to melt first and bridge the gap between the two petals, which will hopefully give us a little bit more chance of success. So now I'm going to attempt to, it's kind of like operation. Oops. Put these little pieces of wire on here without completely moving all of the petals of my daisy. Now that I have placed all of my small pieces of 20 gauge wire on the seams, I'm going to go ahead and fuse. One thing to know about joining shapes together is it is tricky and it takes practice. So don't feel discouraged if your first couple links turn out kind of crappy. I always tell all of my students that you can never make any omelets if you don't break some eggs, so it's important to make mistakes because that's how you learn. So I'm going to light my torch, and I'm going to start by heating the entire piece. And the reason that I'm doing this is all of the rings are going to be drawing heat away from each other, which means what you're going to be trying to fuse will not fuse very quickly unless you heat up the whole piece. Okay, so now I've got the metal glowing very faintly orange, which means it's getting pretty warm. So I'm going to start focusing my heat on two of the petals by working in a figure 8 that I want to join together. And what I am looking for is when the metal starts to move around and actually start to be molten. I'm going to do what I call my bounce technique. And what I'm going to do is superheat the seam and then pull away so that I can see how much it's actually going to fuse. It always moves a little bit more than you think it's going to. So again, heat it real quick and then get out of there. And then while the metal's still hot, I can go ahead and just move next door, working in a figure 8. And I can already see my little piece of 20 gauge wire starting to melt. So I'm going to start superheating the seam and then getting out of there. And then move next door. And don't forget that even heat is really the key to keep things kind of rocking and rolling here without having it melt into oblivion. Continuing along, fusing one seam right after the next so that the piece stays good and hot and we don't have to do a lot of work heating it up repeatedly. and superheat the seam. And bounce back as soon as you see it start to move around. And now the last seam. Don't worry if it looks a little bit organic. We are going to be doing some light hammering to this piece, so that should hide any organicness that may or may not occur. So when this piece tends to fail, the places that it tends to pull too thin and fall apart are right at the corners of your pie and also right in the center. So you'll want to keep a really close eye on those spots. Before I quench this, I'm actually going to flip it over and take a look at the seams on the back side, just to make sure that I have a good join on all of them and I can see that they are fully fused. This piece looks pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and throw it in my quenching bowl. And ta-da! It's now a daisy. Now that we have fused our daisy component, the metal is really soft because we just heated it up. So if you need to do any adjustments to the basic shape of the daisy, now is the time to do it. If we kind of look at this, you can see some of the petals are sticking up a little bit higher than the others. So I'm going to go in very gently and start tweaking the shape of my daisy just so it ends up looking a little bit more like a daisy. It's important to do any shaping that needs to be done. Now while the metal's soft, this one I think needs to be a little bit taller, so I'm going to pull with my pliers until I am satisfied with the way that it looks. I am very, very gently squeezing along the outside of the daisy to kind of round out the flowers just to make them look a little bit more like a daisy. So I'm pleased with this shape, so I'm going to go ahead and hammer. Have my bench block. I'm going to place the daisy on the bench block, and then I'm going to use my chasing hammer to flatten it. When you are hammering on seams that you have just fused together, it's probably a good idea not to pound the crap out of your daisy, but to take it a little bit easy, just so you don't end up popping any of those seams open. So I'm very lightly flattening my daisy, making sure I keep my fingers out of the way of my hammer. Once I have flattened the daisy, now I'd like to put some hammered texture in there, which gives it a little bit more sparkle. So I'm going to flip my hammer over, and using the ball end, I'm gently going to hammer in some texture. So now I have a textured daisy. And at this point I'm actually going to take my component and I am going to put it into a tumbler with a stainless steel jewelry shot mix. And the reason for putting this in the tumbler is first of all to harden and strengthen the metal, although by hammering we've already hardened the metal quite significantly. It also is going to bring this daisy up to a nice high shine, which will look a lot nicer as a finished product. I'm going to tumble this for about 20 minutes, which is all that we should need since we did actually hammer the component. If I flip this daisy over, you can see on the back, doesn't have any texture, it's just nice and smooth, and you can still see the seams just slightly, but since this is the back side of the piece, I'm not really going to worry about that showing. I have here two different sizes of daisy components so that you can get an idea of what different sizes of mandrels will do for your daisy. The first one I have is a little bit smaller, so when you're making an earring or something like that, it's going to be a little bit lighter weight, which will feel a little bit more comfortable. And this was made with about a 7 to 8 millimeter mandrel, and you can see my rings are fairly small. The size that we discussed earlier was a larger 10 millimeter mandrel and makes larger rings and therefore a larger daisy. And this one I'm actually going to show as a pendant so that this can be a versatile link that you can use in many different ways. To turn this into a pendant, I'm going to use a couple of simple things. The first is I'm going to add my bead to the bottom using a ball head pin. And again, just in case you forgot, you can check out our ball head pin video to get more information on that. I'm going to form a wire wrapped loop. And if you're unfamiliar with doing a wire wrapped loop, there is also a wire wrapped loop video that you can check out for more information. But I'm simply going to create my wire wrapped loop, making sure that my loop is made towards the back of my pliers. I'm working with Lindstrom pliers. They have very fine tips. If you make the loop too small, the bead will not be able to swing freely on the component. So I'm going to make a relatively large loop. And then open it up just slightly so that I will be able to fit my component through. So I'm going to slide this onto my component. And then coil my tail so that I have a nice secure wire wrapped loop. Now I'm going to tuck the tail in just in case so it doesn't be itchy and pokey while it's being worn. Now I'm going to use a open sterling silver jump ring to attach my pendant to this really adorable popcorn chain, also available here at Beaducation.com. When I'm working with jump rings, I like to use 2 pairs of pliers, much like closing a jump ring for fusing. Going to grab my ring and open it slightly side to side. Never pull your jump rings open. Going to slip this on the loop directly above where I have added my embellishment, and then also around my chain. And close up my jump ring very securely. So now I have a pendant, which is ready to be worn. For earrings, I have a couple of components that I've already wire wrapped beads to the bottom. I also have some sterling silver ear wires and 2 different types of jump rings. These are open sterling silver jump rings, and these are actually soldered sterling silver jump rings. First, I'm going to, using 2 pairs of chain nose pliers, I'm going to open up the loop on my ear wire to the side. Again, you don't ever want to pull the loop open this way because you will misshape the loop. And I'm going to slip one of the closed jump rings onto the ear wire and close it back up nice and tight. Now I'm going to open the larger of my jump rings, and this is about a 5mm jump ring. I'm going to slip it through my closed jump ring and then also through my daisy component, but we want to make sure that when we put this on that the ear wire is going to end up facing in the correct direction. So just take a second to check which way you're slipping the jump ring on there so that the earring faces forward. And once you close that up very well, now it's an earring. Repeating the same steps for the second earring. I'm going to open my ear wire, open it a little bit more, slip my closed jump ring onto the ear wire and close it tightly. And then open my larger jump ring, slip it through the ear wire, and then also through my component on the link opposite from my bead or embellishment. And now they're gorgeous earrings to go with your pendant. Thanks so much for joining me for class today. And don't forget, if you have any questions, you can always feel free to shoot us an email here at Beaducation.com. One thing to remember is that with this specific technique, practice really does make perfect. So don't feel bad if you have a couple of trip-ups in the beginning.